It's my pleasure to welcome David Barsamian to Yellow Springs and to the Little Art. He is the founder and director of Alternative Radio, a weekly one-hour public affairs program offered free to all public radio stations in the US, Canada, Europe, and beyond. For more than 25 years, David has brought the voices and ideas of some of the most important progressive thinkers and writers to the world, ranging from Howard Zinn, Naomi Klein, and Noam Chomsky, and Vandana Shiva. Did I pronounce that name right? Shiva. To millions in the United States and around the world. He has co-authored numerous books, many taken from his interviews with some of the leading scholars and activists of the day. His interviews and articles appear regularly in such publications as The Nation, The Progressive, and Z Magazine. David's work is extremely important as progressive voices and ideas have been ignored and distorted by the corporate-controlled media. His commitment to speak out for the devalued and the oppressed recently resulted in his being banned from India for his efforts to illuminate the oppressive effects of state power there. David's visit to Yellow Springs and the Miami Valley is supported by Antioch College, the Arthur Morgan House Bed and Breakfast, the Sunrise Cafe, the Little Art Theater, the University of Dayton, Wittenberg University, Wright State University, and WYSO. And I want to give a special thanks to David Nybert, who's here in the audience tonight. This would not have happened without his efforts. Please give me help me give me a warm welcome for David Barsamian.
Dun, 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 dun. We interrupt this program to bring you this breaking news story. TIBC, the Truth in Broadcasting Corporation, from our secret underground headquarters in Area 51 in Nevada. I'm Dick Veneer, your glib and banal anchor of Facade News. Facade News, the 24/7 newscast dedicated to keeping you in the dark. We go straight to the surface of a story, and we stay there. No one can challenge our in-shallow reporting. We adhere to the highest standards of journalism. We deceive, you believe. Ladies and gentlemen, an amazing story coming across our news desk at this very moment. According to WYSO, an obscure radio station in Yellow Springs, Ohio, they are reporting that Ben Bernanke, Hank Paulson, Alan Greenspan, Timothy Geithner, Larry Summers, Robert Rubin, and Lloyd Blankfein and other government officials and bankers have been arrested for financial crimes against the American people and the environment. They were found in a bunker under the Little Art Theater. Under a huge mattress with trillions of dollars in cash, a stash of World Wrestling Federation DVDs, and a massive collection of Pat Boone 45s, and Kenny G and Barry Manilow CDs, and scores of Papa John's pizza boxes, used. They were taken into custody by a heretofore unknown group calling itself YSLF, Yellow Springs Liberation Front. According to Nybert, who refused to give his first name, a spokesperson for this so-called group, he said, "This action is long overdue. We're dedicated to nonviolence and did not use force. But we're sick and tired of waiting for the Justice Department to bring these criminals to account. They must face justice," he said, his voice rising in indignation. The prisoners, shackled in orange jumpsuits and with black cloaks over their heads, were later reported to have defiantly shouted at their captors, "Do you know who we are? We are the masters of the universe. We are the lords of finance. We rule the world." And then, inexplicably, every single one of them burst into tears and said, "I want my mommy." If convicted, they'll do time at Guantanamo. You'll recall the infamous excuse me, You'll recall the infamous U.S. prison that was returned to Cuban sovereignty in late 2012. It looks like curtains for the former masters of finance. Their heads were bowed as they were led away by blue-helmeted peacekeepers of the Yusselov, Yellow Springs Liberation Front, led by Commander Morgan, who would not give her first name. I'm Dick Veneer. You're still glib and banal anchor of Facade News, the 24/7 newscast dedicated to keeping you in the dark. Stay tuned to the TIBC network for updates on this breaking news story. Remember, we deceive, you believe. You either watch our news or you will be watched. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. Well, good evening, Yellow Springs. How nice it is to be here. It's been over 20 years since I've been in this town. There was a radio conference, I think, in the early 90s that brought me here. And I almost didn't make it today because there was some conflicts with Air Force One and Air Force Two. And my flight from Denver was circling overhead. We got very nice close-ups of, you know, the surrounding area of Dayton, and then a very comforting comment from the pilot. Maybe we shouldn't have heard it. You know, we might be running out of fuel pretty soon. So, you know, that was what's going on with, you know, the president and the vice president landing at two separate airstrips. That's in case, you know, the evildoers decided to strike and perhaps take them out. But it's, anyway, finally made it. Great to be here. Thanks to David Nybert and all the people here in this area that have put this trip, this tour together. I'll be speaking, of course, here and then tomorrow in a couple of places and some more places on Thursday. So you can look at my website, alternativeradio.org, for the exact locations of these various performance art. That's kind of what I do that I'll be giving. I'd like to remind you all also that you can hear alternative radio on WYSO, your community radio station, Wednesday nights at the bright and early time of 11 p.m. Not a time that a lot of people use the radio. I hope you listen to the radio at that time. But if you can't and you're interested in maybe securing a better time for alternative radio, you could contact your community radio station, YSO, and lobby for a time. I mean, it's not rocket science. I mean, there's study after study that show that once the sun goes down, radio audiences simply disappear. And by that time, there's a scant handful of listeners. So we think it's, of course, important material. Alternative radio is this huge media conglomerate occupying a space in Boulder, Colorado, well over 225 square feet. I urge you all to visit Boulder and come by and see our world corporate headquarters. It's me and two other people part-time. So support independent media, support your community radio station, and here's a shout out to Uncommon Sense, which is here this evening through the person of Andy and his sterling crew. This is your independent media right here in this part of Ohio. I'm going to pass out, I'm not going to pass out, I feel really great. I'm going to pass out a sign-up sheet. You understand, I have to do this for Homeland Security. They want, you know, get an update on you. They probably have all your information already, but just in case they don't, we need just your name and an email so we can give you updates on alternative radio. This will not be shared with anyone. However, there's a very strict condition. This is a pretty young audience. Nobody here remembers a class that used to be taught called penmanship? No. Okay, let me explain. You have to write clearly. This is a prerequisite. I just came back from giving 3 talks in 2 days in the LA area, and I couldn't read half the names, half the addresses, because people have kind of lost the art of writing clearly. So if you could do that, it'd be much appreciated. And I'm here also, of course, to talk about my new book with Richard Wolff, Occupy the Economy, Challenging Capitalism. It's in its third printing, I'm glad to say, and maybe some of you saw us at City Lights Bookstore a couple of weeks ago on C-SPAN. Both Richard and I appeared at City Lights, that fabled, legendary bookstore in North Beach in San Francisco on Columbus Avenue, founded by the great poet and activist Lawrence Ferlinghetti. So this book is published by City Lights. For them, it's a big deal that it's in its third printing. So I'm really proud to be associated with City Lights and the book publishing part of it. An earlier book I did a couple of years ago is called Targeting Iran, and it hasn't lost a beat in terms of its relevance, because basically the same propaganda points are being regurgitated over and over again. In fact, many of the same propagandists are just recirculating the press releases that they were writing in 2001, 2002, 2003, and just changing the Q in Iraq to an N for Iran, and repeating the same shibboleths, the same mendacities. And we have to be really careful about being led down the narrow path of yet another war. And it was Martin Luther King, in his greatest speech ever at Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967. This is when he talked openly for the first time about the Vietnam War, and it's an incredible speech. It's on the alternative radio site, and if you look at it today and just change a few of the names around, if you insert Iraq or Afghanistan or Iran for every time that he says Vietnam, you'll see the prescience of what he had to say in his analysis. And he said, "A time comes when silence is betrayal." And we are at a time, again, where silence is betrayal. It is in this speech that King calls the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And he warns the country that if it does not change its ways from this avaricious, acquisitive, capitalist-driven military machine, that it will repeat Vietnam's in the future. And one of the countries I think he mentions is in fact, Afghanistan. This is not the King that is broadcast on the Petroleum Broadcasting Service, also known as PBS, brought to you mostly by ExxonMobil and Chevron Texaco. It will not be broadcast on national propaganda radio, NPR, morning edition, that's MOURNING, and some things considered. They do consider some things, so you get to hear Robert Siegel and Cokie Roberts and Steve Inskeep and all of the other blatherers of the received wisdom. And of course, as many of us listen to NPR, I listen to it too, just as I read the New York Times, every day. I want to know what they are thinking. What's the latest trope being spun from a ruling class ideology. And of course, much of the censorship that happens in these media institutions is one of omission rather than commission. It's what they leave out rather than what they include. I'm getting a kind of echo up here. And is it from this thing or not?
It's just the volume she turned. She's turning it down.
Okay, we just turn the volume down. So on King's birthday, it's a ritual, right? Every media outlet plays the I Have a Dream speech from August 1963, which is a fantastic piece of oratory. I mean, it's sheer poetry, the cascading rhythms and just the magnificence of the moment. But this speech at Riverside Church is buried. That's not the King that they want you to know about, that he was in fact moving toward a very radical position. So he's kind of frozen on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. He never evolves into a radical anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist thinker and analyst. And it's important to point out that when he was murdered in Memphis, exactly a year to the day after the Riverside Church speech, he was there in support, in solidarity of striking sanitation workers. And he was on his way to Washington to inaugurate a Poor People's Campaign, which had the Johnson administration, in a tizzy. So that Martin Luther King, we need to celebrate that one, not the one that has been manufactured for us as a very safe kind of hero. I was in San Jose a couple of weeks ago. I mean, I've literally been traveling nonstop for the last couple of months. I was there on September 11th in the richest state, the 8th largest economy in the world. The San Jose Mercury News, one column says, the governor's saying the state is not bankrupt. Even after it's laid off 11,000 teachers, it's consolidated many school districts, it's closed many schools, but we're not broke, everything is just going to be fine. And then right next to it, of course, on September 11th, will this wound ever be healed, with a picture of the World Trade Center? And the answer to that, the wound of 9/11, right? The answer to that is never. It is never going to be healed. You are constantly going to be reminded of it in order to be used as a justification for more intervention, more aggression, more wars, more occupations, more drone strikes, and a bigger and better military budget, as was announced during the farcical debate last night by the president, who said, as long as I'm commander-in-chief, the United States will have the most powerful military the world has ever known. Well, it's an interesting kind of boast. I would like to hear a president say we'd have the best educational system the world has ever known, or the best environment, or the best healthcare system the world has ever known. But, that doesn't play to the macho crowd. It doesn't play to the fruit salad generals, who populate all the talk shows with their quite off-center comments about, what's going on in the world, such as when Anderson Cooper, a very respected journalist, he doesn't yell at people, he seems to speak English, he knows what adjectives and adverbs are, I'm not talking about, Fox here. I mean, to talk about Fox, I think, is a total waste of time. I think we have to talk about the liberal media, the really, elite opinion of forming media, as Chomsky calls them, which is the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, yes, NPR, yes, PBS, and sometimes, CNN, although Anderson Cooper also doubles up as a CBS Reports journalist. So he had typically, this is just one. Anyone can do this kind of work, by the way, for any young people in the audience or any age person. Media analysis is as simple as turning on your, the flame in your oven, let's say. There's nothing to it. It just requires common sense. And it just requires a sense of history and of knowledge of public affairs. So this is, the typical kind of media structure. There's the retired general. We learn his name is David Grange. I think he probably works for one of the big military contractors, but that's, down the road to be revealed. And Anderson Cooper asks, the retired general, how dangerous is Iran? Okay, so now we're starting the discussion about Iran. So Iran is a danger. We're going to learn how dangerous it is, right? It's like, how poisonous is the water? How bad is alcohol for your health? It already embeds a fact, and then the discussion takes off from that embedded fact. And then the next question is, from Anderson, how effective will a strike on Iran be? And then there's the back and forth. Well, if the B-52s are used to soften up the targets, but I think, the Navy's going to have to play a big part in this. We're going to have, Trident missiles being launched from our submarines in the Persian Gulf, to take out those sites. But finally, we need boots on the ground. You can't verify this stuff simply from reconnaissance satellites. We need on-the-ground verification. So I'm in favor of, inserting an interventionary force of Marines. So nowhere in this so-called discussion, of course, is any history mentioned, is any law mentioned, or God forbid, or the goddess forbid, the UN Charter, which is explicitly not only criminalizes attacks and aggression against other countries, even the threat of war, of aggression, is a crime according to the according to the UN Charter, which took its words directly from the Nuremberg Tribunal of 1945-1946, which determined that the act of aggression is the supreme international war crime from which all other crimes evolve. And that those very words were taken from the Nuremberg Charter, put into the UN Charter, and the term, even the threat of war, is a crime. Well, that's being done on a routine basis. I mean, can you imagine if Iran were issuing threats to the United States? If Iran said all options are on the table every other day, that's practically a mantra that's repeated over and over again by administration officials. So this wound will never heal. We will be reminded of it constantly in order to justify what is coming down the pike, unless there's a fundamental change in the direction the country is going in. Because we are living in a military-industrial complex. Maybe we could add the media to that. I mean, this is no deep thought. Eisenhower said this in 1961. Eisenhower, a five-star general, no peacenik, no follower of Mahatma Gandhi, leader of all Allied forces in Europe, commander of the D-Day invasion. He warned the American people on January 17th, 1961, that the country was facing a military-industrial complex, and he saw this as a great danger for democracy. In the next paragraph, which is rarely cited, he also says that one tonic, one serum to address this toxicity, this poison, would be an informed and aroused citizenry. Well, we can see with the propaganda system here how effective that informed and aroused citizenry has become. Eisenhower began his presidency in 1953 with a comment that every gun, every penny that is spent on the military is in the final analysis a theft from those who are hungry and for those who are not clothed. That was Eisenhower in 53, and then couple that with the military-industrial complex. I mean, if Eisenhower, to show you what has happened to politics in the United States in the lifetime of most of the people in this audience, Eisenhower would have no place not only in the Republican Party, he would have no place in the Democratic Party. That's how radical he would seem today to the political pundits, to the rulers of the two main political parties. For another reason, also, Eisenhower, all this stuff about we got to cut taxes in order to, generate profits because of our entrepreneurs, the job creators, as it keeps being called. This is the 1%, by the way, the job creators. We need to cut taxes for them because of the burden of government regulation and taxation is just too much. It's stifling their creative juices. I mean, if you believe stories like this, I have a bridge in Brooklyn I'd love to sell you. Just see me after the lecture. I'll get you a great price, don't worry. And why do I say this? In the 1950s, under Eisenhower, what was the high tax rate on corporations? It was 91%. 91%, mark that. Now, what was going on in the US economy in the 1950s? Was there stagnation? Was there massive unemployment? Was there stagflation? Was there depression? The 1950s witnessed the greatest expansion, economic expansion and growth of wealth, not only in the history of the United States, but in the history of the world. That was with a 91% corporate tax rate, when the rich when the 1/10 of 1% were in fact paying their fair share of taxes. Not like today, when the high rate is 35%, and many corporations are not even paying that. General Electric, which made $14 billion net profit. You know, it's a little bit less than what you make in a year, I understand. But still, you know, 14 billion, that's not chump change. You know, you can buy a few lattes and a few mochas with that. They didn't pay any taxes because, you know, all of those profits were generated overseas, you know, offshore, where they have, you know, their accounts and they have all of these other things, financial, you know, wherewithal to game the system. 37 of the largest corporations paid no tax whatsoever in the last year on record. So it's interesting, you know, as Howard Zinn used to point out, you know, and Gore Vidal for that matter, that, you know, we live in the USA, the United States of amnesia. There's no memory of anything. You know, last week is history, last month is ancient history, and last year, well, that's, you know, that's Noah's time. Let's build the ark. Let's get two of each animal and put them on the ark. So we live in a kind of a culture where we're not reminded of things. And, you know, no less an authority than George Santayana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And particularly in terms of Iran now and the threat of war against Iran. I've been to Iran a few times. You know, it has severe internal problems, exacerbated by the most severe sanctions regime in the history of the world. This is announced with great fanfare and pride by Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and the others around them. It is proving to be causing great suffering among average Iranians, you know, who have seen the price of grains, of fruit, of meat and other essentials, sugar, rice, simply skyrocket. It's not going to hurt the regime on top. In fact, if the Iraq experience in the 90s is any lesson, people will move closer to the regime because they need to depend on the state to provide them with sugar and milk and those kinds of essentials. Now, with the post 9/11 America, and I'll get to the economic issues in detail. The so-called war on terror is now in its 11th year. And what has been the impact here in the homeland? Well, you don't have to go very far, just to Dayton Airport or to Denver Airport and see just one manifestation of the results of the war on terror. The ballooning of a huge security apparatus called Homeland Security, within it the transport TSA, the Transportation Security Administration. Snooping, prying, eavesdropping, call it what you want. The government is doing it on a scale never before seen. Sophisticated new technologies allow for far more intrusions into our private lives. Beyond the ever-present cameras, there's deep data mining, nanosecond biometric identification, and drone aircraft in the skies above. Drone aircraft even being used by local police departments. I don't know about Yellow Springs and Dayton, but I can tell you about Denver. I was shocked 4 years ago during the Democratic National Convention to see the Denver City Police, you know, on duty, looking like a SEALs team, with helmets and high-velocity weapons and having armored cars. And this is happening across the country. Again, the Department of Homeland Security is supplying a lot of these police departments with very lethal weapons, including drones and armored cars, and as well as other surveillance mechanisms. So state surveillance power undermining basic freedoms in the name of protecting them is growing relentlessly. The swelling domestic databases of the NSA and FBI probably contain your personal information. And this burgeoning Orwellian apparatus has become a cash cow for a lot of corporations, providing what are called euphemistically security services. Comedian Stephen Colbert probably one of our deepest analysts, sarcastically observes, there are bound to be casualties in the never-ending war on terror. And one of them just happens to be the United States Constitution. There was a resolution passed by the city of Santa Fe a couple of months ago when I was there. No attack on Iran. Boulder, Colorado has passed this. I think Missoula, Montana. It's, these are not binding resolutions, but it conveys a certain opposition to a possible war with Iran. And of course, they did publish a map of Iran, and I'll hold that close to the microphone so people can see it. Iran seems to be in a part of the world called the Middle East. And the United States is 10,000 miles away, not in that part of the world called the Middle East, yet it is surrounding Iran with military bases. And here's a great headline from the New York Times, that Iran seeks wider Mideast role. How dare they? Who do they think they are? I mean, they have neighbors on one side, Afghanistan, Pakistan, two very unstable states. I've been to both of them. Jihadi groups from Pakistan, who are Sunni, despise Iranian Shias and launch attacks from Pakistan into Iran. When I was there a few years ago, a bus got blown up and 25 people were killed by a group from Pakistan that came across the border called Jandala. That kind of thing goes on a routine basis. When the Taliban were ruling Afghanistan, Iranian diplomats were massacred in Mazar-e-Sharif. Thousands of Afghan Shia were massacred by the Taliban. The Taliban are an extreme Wahhabi Salafist group. They get their sustenance and their theology, let us say, not ideology, their theology from that great bastion of human rights and feminism, Saudi Arabia, one of the strongest U.S. Allies. So yes, Iran is concerned about what's going on in neighboring Iraq. It's concerned about what's going on right along its immediate borders, as it should be. Yet the New York Times uses, and the Obama administration, or whoever it is, this is pretty much, when it comes to imperialism, it's pretty much bipartisan, by the way. The only difference is, about tactics. Not rather than overall strategic vision, because the gauntlet was laid down in the Grand Area Planning document issued by the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations, calling the oil reserves of the Middle East a strategic source of power and a stupendous source of wealth in the history of the world. And so that has been the guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy, and this was crafted well before the founding of the State of Israel, incidentally. In the mid-1940s, 1942, 1943, it became obvious to the planners in Washington that the U.S. was going to win the war. And the Roosevelt White House instructed the State Department, draw up some plans. We want to see what the post-war world will look like and what the U.S. role will be. And that's where that comment comes from about the oil of the Middle East is a stupendous source of strategic power and the greatest source of material wealth in the world. This was all sealed. The Faustian bargain was struck on February 12th, 1945 in the Suez Canal. Probably most of you haven't heard about this. FDR, who had just come from Yalta, exactly 2 months before he was to die in Warm Springs, Georgia, meets with Ibn Saud, the king of Saudi Arabia. And there the deal is struck. You talk about a Faustian bargain. We will defend and protect the Saudi regime in return for unfettered access to Saudi oil by U.S. corporations. And that's when that went down, and that has been the guiding motif of a U.S. foreign policy ever since. Of course, you can't say that outright, so you have to talk about freedom, democracy, Arab Springs. You have to lie about history, like Hillary Clinton lying to the Washington Press Corps. And I know enough French to know how to pronounce that word. They are a corpse. They're not doing journalism, they're doing stenography. You know, instead of having a fourth estate, they are for the state. They're lapdogs with laptops, you know, competing for the best hair on the air. And this is right across the board, you know, from Martha Raddatz to Diane Sawyer to Brian Williams. You know, all of them are almost identical in their subservience to power and their ability to embed all of the doctrine, you know, hegemonic doctrine that the ruling class puts out. So Hillary Clinton is having this press conference at the height of the Tahrir Square uprising in late January, early February 2011. And she announces to the press corps that no country has done more for democracy in Egypt than the United States of America. And nobody bursts out laughing. Or like we say in New York, are you kidding me? I mean, are you pulling my leg here or what? I mean, do you all think we're stupid? That we have no memory of history? I mean, the US, that is us, we the people, backed the Mubarak dictatorship from its inception for 30 years, giving him billions and billions of dollars, very little of which reached the Egyptian people. Most of it was pocketed by himself, his cronies, and the military-industrial complex within Egypt. But again, with no memory, with no media. I remember also during this time, NPR, you know, Some Things Considered, was referring in the early days of the Tahrir Square uprising to Mubarak as President Mubarak, a moderate leader in a turbulent area, you know, US ally Mubarak. Then when things became apparent that, you know, there was a widespread revulsion against Mubarak, all of a sudden he became the tyrant Mubarak. He became a totalitarian leader. He became an autocrat. And no one seemed to notice this transition, this lexical transition from ally, friend, moderate, reasonable man to autocrat, totalitarian dictator. It just was like two ships passing in the night, because the propaganda system is almost seamless, and without repetition, without constant, you know, information about the historical record, people think, oh yeah, the U.S. has, you know, never supported Mubarak. It's done more for democracy than any other country. I mean, it's pretty hard to miss this, and it really shows you how disciplined the intellectual class is in this country. You know, the people who write op-eds and who go on the television shows, the punditocracy and the radio programs, you know, who deliver, you know, erudite wisdom about, you know, what's going on in the world. It's like what Orwell said, often what's right in front of your nose is the most difficult thing to see. But this is a very disciplined intellectual class that we have here in the United States. They know if they want to get ahead, if they want to be successful, if they want to be invited to, you know, to White House dinners or State Department briefings, then you go along with the system. You become a cog in the wheel. And that's basically how the propaganda system here functions. And it, you know, the payoffs are considerable. These guys are millionaires, and I should say these gals, you know, from Katie Couric to all of them. You know, they're making an enormous amount of money, and that class divide is very, very significant. Of course, I just uttered a word that can hardly be spoken in polite company, and that is class, you know, very much like imperialism. There are certain taboo words that the discourse will simply reject. Or you will be ridiculed if you use them, or disparaged or derided. Hey, are you some kind of conspiracy nut? You know, you got a radio program, David. You're talking in Yellow Springs. You're speaking at, you know, Wright College tomorrow. You're speaking in Xenia the day after. You know, you can do whatever you want. But, you know, there's a handful of people like me and Amy Goodman and a few others that are doing this kind of work. And so, you know, that's one way the system perpetuates itself. It has created a class that supports it, that gives it its intellectual legitimacy. And those of us on the margin, you know, are trying to get the word out. But, you know, it's really hard to get it out when in the great state of Ohio, alternative radio can be heard in Yellow Springs Wednesday nights at 11, and in Youngstown, Ohio, on Sunday mornings at 6. So pick your poison. You know, what's a worse time? And in no other city or town in the state is the program heard, nor is it heard in Michigan. You know, which you would think with its, you know, unemployment and other issues could use a program such as alternative radio. So we have to talk about the military-industrial complex, and, you know, if, as I said, Eisenhower's warning, if he were alive today, he wouldn't recognize the country, because what he described in 1961 was just incipient. It was just nascent. It was just forming. Today you have Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Raytheon and United Technologies and General Dynamics and General Electric and all of the other big military contractors, you know, and subcontractors, you know, who put their production in different districts, so making it very difficult for representatives to vote against these gold-plated weapon systems. And one of the things that the mythology that has, you know, sunk into the aquifer and is now repeated over and over again, another propaganda trope, is that, well, these are jobs. Yes, they are jobs, but they are not labor-intensive jobs. They are capital-intensive jobs. Someone working on a missile, or compared to someone building a school, the number of workers, and there have been a huge number of studies on this, documenting this, you get much more productivity and you employ many more people if you build a school, if you build a road, if you build a hospital, a health clinic, a rec center, if you maintain trails in national and state parks, if you build swimming pools, the kind of things that were done during the New Deal under the WPA and the CCC. Again, with no memory and no history being taught in most classes, people's eyes glaze over when I mention these acronyms: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, two of the cornerstones of FDR's New Deal program to get America back to work and creating millions and millions of jobs. But for propaganda to be effective, you need constant repetition. And this was, you know, I think Goebbels said, Hitler's propaganda minister, with constant repetition, we can convince people that a circle is a square and a square is a circle. These are just words. We'll just manipulate those words until we believe, you know, we convince people that the sun indeed, you know, rises in the west and sets in the east. We can control the public mind. But I don't want to, you know, just lay it at the door of the Nazis, who are a very convenient, you know, kind of target, but, you know, right with the American ruling class and people like Edward Bernays, the founder of modern propaganda. He was a double nephew of Freud. He wrote a book called Propaganda back in a time when they openly stated what their intentions were. And he said that in a democratic society, I'm almost quoting verbatim, control of the public mind is absolutely essential, because it's more difficult in a liberal democratic society to use the gun, to use the baton, to use the truncheon, although they are using it more and more, as we've seen with the police violence against the Occupy movement all across the country, particularly in places like Oakland and New York as well. Bernays also was the propaganda architect of the coup in 1954, destroying democracy in Guatemala, convincing the people of the United States that Jacobo Arbenz was a communist and that Guatemala posed a national security threat to the United States, and it had to be overthrown. And that was the end of democracy. Kind of ironic, as Arbenz was a kind of middle-of-the-road Democrat, lowercase d, who actually admired FDR and wanted to introduce some of those kinds of programs that FDR promulgated during the New Deal to his desperately poor country. The year before that, democracy was destroyed in Iran. Mohammad Mossadegh, and Iranians have a memory of their history. It's not like the US. People know what happened in Iran, and Iran has, you know, as I said, lots of internal problems, but it hasn't invaded another country in 250 years. I challenge anyone to go through maybe 2.5 months of US history to make the same claim, that the US has not either bombed or threatened or occupied or invaded or imposed sanctions on another country. So just remember that when you hear about, Iran is a great threat, it's coming, we've got to do something about Iran. I mean, the same people who were discredited on Iraq are making the same arguments today. Now, I think I want to talk a little bit more about the economy, 1%, 99%, those kinds of issues. But I want to start with this. I'll hold this close to the camera so that you can pick us up. I was in Eugene during the Republican primaries. Does anyone remember that? It was one of the great moments in American intellectual life. And I picked up, it was hard to compete with those geniuses that were campaigning at the time. I picked up this brochure from Ron Paul, and like all, I'm not picking on Ron Paul, it's like all the other brochures, he's looking very resolute into the, with his eyes, full of determination. And underneath him are the founding fathers. Now, you'll see that this is a kind of urgent connection that every single political candidate, no matter what his stripe may be, Republican or Democrat or liberal or whatever, conservative, they somehow want to yoke themselves to these almost godlike figures. And when we say the word founding fathers, these guys here, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, and the rest, it's almost in hushed tones, because they were not ordinary mortals. These were gods that descended on earth and gave birth to our republic. Well, it's Michael Parenti, who I've featured many times on alternative radio, calls them the founding finaglers. They have quite a bit to answer for, but let me just give you a couple of comments that kind of sketch out the very basis of the class-ruled society we have here in the United States, the society of the 1% versus the 99%. James Madison, who's regarded as one of these geniuses, he wrote most of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton wrote a few of them. He's two-time president of the United States, principal author of the Constitution of the United States. He was asked what the aim of government was. He said, the aim of government is to protect the opulent minority against the majority. The aim of government is to protect the opulent minority against the majority. Now his friend and colleague, John Jay, comes along and goes one step better. John Jay is the first United States Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was the president of the Constitutional Congress. What did he say? Those who own the country ought to govern it. Those who own the country ought to govern it. So pretty much since then, with some exceptions, the U.S. has been on a certain trajectory in terms of concentration of power. Now, this concentration of power has led to incredible inequalities, not just income inequalities, but wealth inequalities. Income inequality is pretty straightforward, and we have the Occupy movement to thank for injecting that into the political discourse so that even mainstream politicians at least have to utter the words every once in a while, even though they're probably choking on the very concept. Income inequality is very straightforward. I earn $30,000. This gentleman here in the first row, he earns $40,000. Okay, so that's our income inequality. It's $10,000. I have, a savings account. I have an IRA. I rent an apartment, and that's about it. I kind of live paycheck to paycheck. Then I find out that our brother here has a ski lodge in Aspen. He has apartments in New York. He has a penthouse in Paris. He owns property outside of London. He has hedge funds. He has investments in private equity funds. He has stocks. He has bonds. He has a private jet. He has a private pilot to pilot the jet. He has a fleet of limousines, and he has drivers for all of these different cars. He's a member of a golf club. He's a member of the yacht club. He owns a yacht. He owns several yachts. And on and on and on. So in terms of wealth inequality, his wealth is, sky high, and mine is barely off the ground. And that kind of division has sharpened here in the United States, particularly from the mid-1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, when wages go flat and something dramatic happens to American capitalism. It stops growing. It stopped growing in the traditional ways it had been growing, and that is in terms of creating a kind of sinecure for the middle class. So it was possible to own a car or to finally buy a house. That came to a screeching halt in the mid-1970s. The great expansion had kind of ended. And I must say, I failed to point out when I talked about Eisenhower and what happened in the 50s, the greatest economic expansion in the history of the world. That was largely fueled by what? The greatest investment in intellectual resources in the US, the GI Bill. 12 to 15 million American returning servicemen and women were educated for free at the public expense. We paid for that, gladly, I should say. And they were the fuel. That was the engine that drove that great economic expansion. People like Howard Zinn, my dear friend, who would have been 90 on August 24th, and I've got a couple of books here with Howard Zinn. He couldn't dream of going to college. I mean, he grew up in the slums of Brooklyn. As he told me once, his family was one step ahead of the landlord. At the end of the month, they'd skip out before rent was due. And incredible poverty. He went to work in the shipyards. Then when the war broke out, Brooklyn shipyards, when the war breaks out, he joins the Army Air Force and he becomes a decorated bombardier. Then under the GI Bill, when he comes home, he goes to Columbia University, and educates himself and becomes our great, radical historian and, dear friend and comrade. Now that is forgotten as well, that tremendous investment in the public good. And you see how that is under attack, particularly since the Reagan years, but it continues, right through Clinton and Carter as well, that we are not thinking in terms of the community. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say I don't have kids. Why should I pay taxes for the library? Who cares? You pay. You want to go to the library? You go, you pay for it. I'm not going to pay for it. I don't have kids. Why should I pay for schools? I'm not going to pay for all of these programs. Those who are using the programs should pay for them. This kind of is a divide and rule strategy, which separates us and atomizes us. I would say my life was saved by a public library on 78th Street and York Avenue in New York when I was growing up. Because my parents were immigrants, they were refugees, they barely spoke English, we didn't have any books at home. I was thirsting for knowledge, I was dying, plus I wanted to escape the cockroaches that appeared whenever I turned on the light in the bathroom or the kitchen at night. And the public library in New York provided a space that was clean, that had lots of books, it was well lit, and that was my home. That's where I started, learning about the world, learning about U.S. history and world history and studying geography. So I think that, that kind of thing is really, really important, as well as, public education. Everyone is, I don't know about Ohio, but schools across the country, tuitions are skyrocketing. At the University of Colorado at Boulder, where, in my hometown, there's an active campaign to recruit students from overseas at the expense of residents of Colorado, because students from overseas, particularly from the Emirates and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, they pay 4, 5, 6, 7 times tuition of local students. So they are being privileged over our local students. And so people are being turned away from state universities. Those that continue to go to state universities in Colorado and elsewhere are facing ever escalating tuition costs. And we have all of these gold-plated aircraft carriers and weapons systems. U.S. has 11 aircraft carrier battle groups, by the way, protecting us from, I don't know, Sweden, Bangladesh. Who's going to attack us? Ecuador? Anybody else? Ivory Coast? Senegal? Maybe we're under great threat. We're surrounded by enemies. You know, that's one of the great, propaganda achievements as well, to convince the American people they're in great peril, they're surrounded. In fact, it was during the debate last night, I believe, or was it Leon Panetta who said, who knows what our national security needs will be in the future? There are bound to be new threats out there, and we have to be ready. In other words, don't turn the spigot off on the military-industrial complex. Don't you dare. In fact, Panetta is, even more of a more aggressive and bellicose Secretary of War, rather than, I don't like to use the term Secretary of Defense, because I think that's, obscures what its actual function is. In 1947, maybe a bit more honest of a time, lexically speaking, we had a War Department in this country. That's what they did. They made war. And Howard Zinn noted at that time to himself that something's happening here. They changed it to Department of Defense. That's also when the CIA and the NSA and the National Security Council were also created. Something significant was happening when the War Department became the Defense Department. And all of these, politicians are going on and on about China. We have to, keep the sea lanes open. That's why we have to have aircraft carriers in the Pacific and the South Pacific and Southeast Asia, because China may close the sea lanes. I mean, that is preposterous. Here is a country that is making money hand over fist through international trade. Why would it ever want to close the sea lanes? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But again, with an obedient media, nobody points this out. And you see menacing photographs of Chinese leaders or Chinese, troops that are marching. You never see U.S. troops marching, by the way, except in very innocuous parades or at NFL games where they seem to be omniscient and omnipresent, rather. They're not omniscient. They're the opposite of that. So we have to think about, the democracy here at home. Can we maintain an imperialist, militarized foreign policy and have democracy here at home? And can we have democracy in the face of massive income and wealth inequality? These are, I think, very serious questions that are not being addressed in common political discourse. In fact, they're being scrupulously avoided. It was FDR himself who said the liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of a private power to the point it becomes stronger than their democratic state in itself. That, in essence, is fascism. That's FDR speaking about corporate power. This is 70 years ago. The growth of corporate power, of course, has increased exponentially. A series of Supreme Court decisions, the most recent and odious is Citizens United in January of 2010, which declares that money is free speech and corporations are people. They have rights of person and personhood. A grievous blow to democracy. I mean, there is still, of course, I tell people, yes, we do have a democracy here, but it's in the ICU. The pulse, you can notice that there is a pulse, but it's not very strong, and it seems to be getting weaker every year, particularly now that there are no pretenses left. I mean, money controls the politics in this country. I left the swing state this morning, which is saturated with TV ads from both the major candidates, to come to another swing state this afternoon with also TV saturated with ads from both the major political parties. I mean, it was Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, who said, you can have great concentrations of wealth or you can have democracy, but you can't have both. And we are seeing not the gradual erosion of democracy, but rather the rapid erosion of democracy, which I think should really concern all citizens. I don't think this is a left issue or a right issue. Like nutritious food, is there a liberal view of nutritious food? Is there a conservative view on clean water? I mean, are there some righteous conservatives here this evening? I mean, this is, after all, the state of the Tafts, right? When I was growing up, conservatives, the term conservative was an honorable political description, not what it is today. I mean, they should be called more like radicals. They've completely hollowed out the classic conservative doctrine. I'm talking about Taft and Vandenberg, those kinds of politicians in Washington that believed in conserving what we had and building upon it, not ripping the state to shreds, not destroying the Constitution in the name of defending it, not taking away civil rights and human rights, and not eviscerating the basic fundamentals upon which the country has announced itself on the world stage. Now, I think it's important. I wonder how we're doing on time. Okay, are you still with me? Is there a game on tonight? I think the Bengals played yesterday. The Reds didn't make the playoffs. Sorry, Cleveland didn't make the playoffs. It's tough. No, the Reds made the playoffs, but unfortunately they lost. Right. So I think it's time that we started talking about the realities, and in a way that's unambiguous and unvarnished and not cluttered with political jargon, because I think this is a fundamental issue of survival. When we're talking about capitalism and what it is doing to the environment, we are talking about the long-term status of what Carl Sagan called this pale blue dot in the universe, our home, planet Earth, which is in such critical condition, in which barely, a comment is made in any of the debates about, were the words climate change even uttered? I'm not sure. Not, someone is saying. I didn't listen to or watch all of the debates. It's essentially been pushed to the side. It's all about growth. It's about new jobs. It's about, drilling in the Arctic. It's about drilling in West Virginia and Kentucky. It's about something called clean coal, which has got to be an oxymoron, and fracking, which is going on in Ohio and Pennsylvania. I just learned, Yellow Springs made national news. I don't know if you know this, but that you made history this month when the village council passed an ordinance establishing a community bill of rights for the village and prohibiting shale gas drilling and fracking. They are the first in the state to do so. First community in Ohio to do so. And Mansfield and Broadview Heights have similar amendments on fracking and fracking prohibitions on the ballot in November. So this is, a first step toward local self-governance rather than rule of, by, for, and of the corporations. That's not my line, by the way. That's Maureen Dowd, a very conservative columnist in the New York Times. That's what she's saying about the country today. So how is this going to be reversed? And I think Richard Wolff talks about that in the book that we did together, Occupy the Economy. He and I talk about it. It's kind of odd now because I have to do like a capitalist spiel during a talk in which I'm criticizing capitalism, but this is how I support myself. In addition to getting $100,000 speaking fees from the Little Art Theater. That was the minimum. That was in unmarked 20s, which was left on my porch in a hollowed out pumpkin. People in a certain age group will know what that reference is to. Alger Hiss and Nixon. Speaking of Nixon, I was in Whittier. I'm a double Gemini, I'm sorry. That may mean something to people who know about astrology. If you don't know anything about astrology, just forget I said that. But I do skip around, and I was in Whittier on Friday night. Okay, what could be more exciting than to be in Whittier, California? It took me 2 hours to drive from Santa Monica, where I was out east, southeast to Whittier. Well, this is Nixon's hometown, right? Well, I was thinking, if Nixon were alive today, he would be considered pretty radical on domestic issues, not foreign issues. On foreign issues, he's a dyed-in-the-wool imperialist and warmonger. But on domestic issues, the Freedom of Information Act, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, a whole host of very progressive, liberal pieces of legislation were passed during the Nixon administration, and Chomsky calls him the last liberal president of the United States. So that's the Nixon aside. So mind you, again, Eisenhower would have no place, and Nixon in either party, and Nixon would be considered a way out liberal if he were alive today. Shows you how far the political spectrum in the country has moved. And at the same time, that political spectrum has moved because of the concentration of media. When I started doing this work, there were 50 corporations that controlled most of the media in the United States. Well, what's happened? I started in the late 70s in Boulder. Since then, 50 has become 28, 28, 23, 23, 14, 14, 10, 10, 6, 6, 5. 5 corporations basically control what most people see, hear, and read in the United States. And that's why there's much more information about, the very important Kardashian sisters. I have to mention them because they're Armenian, and I'm Armenian. Or, who Madonna is adopting in Malawi. Or, is Britney Spears' career over? Will Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie stay together, or is their relationship doomed? Can Katie and Tom Cruise get back together again? What will happen to their child? These are the kinds of things that's why I call the media WMD, a weapon of mass distraction. They have more information about things like this, and heated discussions, also about sports, of course, which I know quite a bit about, having been the youngest child, and I had 2 older brothers, and the only way I could relate to them was through sports, so I knew everything about sports. If you listen to these sports shows, it's remarkable. And I think they're also very instructive because it shows that people do have analytical power. It shows that people are extremely critical. They're critical of the coach. Get rid of that bum. He doesn't deserve that job. I'd like to see them say that about the Secretary of State or the Defense Secretary or the President. He doesn't deserve that job. Where did he come from, or where did she come from? They have mastery, and Chomsky's talked about this, and it's in this book I have here called How the World Works. Very modest title. Only Chomsky could come up with something like that. But he points out that these programs show that people do have the ability to deconstruct arguments, to have a deep analysis of and mastery of obscure information. Oh, in 1951, the caller will call up, let's just say, Ted Williams was batting against Allie Reynolds. It was the bottom of the 9th, and the Williams shift was on. All the New York Yankee players were all on the, first base side of second. If only Ted Williams had just laid down a bunt or tried to hit toward third, he would have gotten a double or a triple, and the Red Sox would have won the pennant. Why didn't he do that? And then there'd be the next person would go, don't you criticize Ted Williams. He was the greatest hitter in the history of baseball. And there's a lively debate. But what is it about? Nada. Zilch. It's about nothing of consequence. I wish healthcare reform would be talked about in such a way, or the environment, or education. That kind of passion, that kind of mastery of detail and arcane information. I mean, it's truly astonishing. So to get back to capitalism, so all is not lost. I want to just say by pointing that out. But how can we bring that interest in the Kardashian sisters, and Hollywood celebrities and divorces and that kind of thing, and bring it into the political sphere? Are we simply supposed to show up every November, every 4 years, vote, and then go home and watch, Law and Order reruns? Is that our role as citizens? Is that the best we can do in a democracy? I mean, I'm putting this out here. I mean, you're here in this community. I don't know Yellow Springs at all. So I don't know what kind of organizations you have here, what kind of community services you have here. But to get engaged, to get involved is really, really important. And you'll feel good about yourself. You know, even if you don't have achieved great victories, at least you're active, you're involved with kindred spirits. And that's how movements grow, you know, poco a poco, paso a paso, step by step, little by little. That's how social change happens. It doesn't happen in one fell swoop. So I want to tell you about these 4 one-hour programs that I've brought to you tonight from Boulder, brand new programs. Alternative Radio, Michelle Alexander on Incarceration Nation. She's actually a University of Ohio law professor. Fabulous about the prison industrial complex, what it's doing, particularly to African American males, the whole economic system that supports this prison industrial complex. Glenn Greenwald, what for my money is the best person on what's happening to our rights, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. This is called the surveillance state. And finally, myself and Richard Wolff speaking at City Lights Bookstore, recorded live. That's a 2 CD set. So they're over here along with copies of Occupy the Economy. And for the state of Ohio, I also bought a special treat. I made 5 copies of a debate that Chomsky had with Richard Pearl in 1988. That I got the VHS of it and rolled off the audio. Edward Herman was instrumental in getting that to me. A very wonderful writer and political commentator for Z Magazine. And it's an amazing 2 CD set because Chomsky is talking about the documentary record. He's talking about facts. He's talking about evidence. And Pearl is talking about fantasies, about myths. Oh, the United States would never do that. The United States is dedicated to justice and freedom and spreading democracy around the world. And to hear this, they inhabit parallel universes. It's quite instructive. And Pearl, incidentally, was a favorite of Reagan, and he was one of the architects of the Iraq War. In other words, a major war criminal, along with Dick Cheney and Bush and Rumsfeld and all the others who have gotten a free pass from this administration. And this is how it works. They all protect one another. It's gone down through history like that. If you steal a pizza, if you fill up a tank of gas and drive away from the gas station, you're going to jail. But if you invade a country, if you kill thousands of people, nothing will happen to you. Not only that, nothing will happen to you. You'll write your memoir. You'll go on a lecture tour. You'll get $200,000 to appear, on university campuses all over the country. You'll be invited to the most prestigious news programs. You'll be treated with great honor and respect when you should be wearing striped pajamas. Any Yiddish speakers here? I mean, this is a shanda. This is a crying shame that war criminals have been let off the hook. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think it's outrageous. And it just sets the stage for future war criminals to carry on the same actions because they see that there's no accountability. No one will be brought to justice. And that speaks again to the hollowing out of democracy. You steal a pizza, you go to jail. You don't pay your taxes, you go to jail, or you get, your property is seized or your wages are garnished. But if I rip off a country, if I steal, then I get, not only do I not go to jail, but I'm rewarded handsomely. A lot of young people have figured this out without having to go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Antioch or Worcester. Because it's transparent. This kind of, we're making the world safe for hypocrisy, not democracy. And the hypocrisy starts here at home. And we are complicit in that. It's very hard to get this kind of Titanic moving, and they keep moving the deck chairs around. But basically, the ship is headed for the iceberg. It's obvious. It's right in front of us. I mean, the environmental crisis, which if these reports are to be believed, and they're, almost unanimously now concurred that the rise of the sea level will rise by at least 55 inches by 2100. That's about 4 feet. That's more than 4 feet. That's going to put a great deal of the world underwater. Now, well, what's going to happen? I mean, can capitalism avert this disaster? It cannot. It cannot because of its DNA. Its DNA is to make money. It has to generate profits in order to pay back the investors. That's the political economy that we live under. Not this, magical BS of, Adam Smith and the invisible hand. There's no invisible hand. There's massive state intervention in order to prop up capitalist corporations and banks. You just saw that with the bailout. We got sold out, they got bailed out. So the Occupy movement really was spot on with that. We are, too big to fail. Not only too big to fail, too big to go to jail. I mean, these are major financial crimes that were committed against we the people and the environment as well. So you remember the great movie called, what was the movie with Howard Beale? Oh yeah, Network. I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. I think that's, the righteous kind of attitude that we need in terms of going forward. And we've got to shed the shibboleths and the myths and the fantasies about who we are, who the country is. The country is about them, in their view, about the 1%. And no less of an authority than Warren Buffett, okay? Now, I'm not talking about Noam Chomsky here. One of the richest men in the world. He's regarded as a financial genius. He's the head of Berkshire Hathaway. Everybody goes like this in front of him. He's a great guru. He said that there's a class war being waged in this country, and his class is winning it. He was also the one who pointed out that, proportionally speaking, his secretary pays more in taxes than he does. Well, we've all known that for a long time. The tax code has also been used as a weapon against the people. I mean, there's all kinds of iniquities in the tax code. But, can you afford high-priced New York lawyers and accountants to game the system? Of course not. You got to, if you're lucky, you'll take it to your local accountant, or you'll do it yourself. But those guys, the guys with means, have the ability to game the system because they have the capital to hire those lawyers and accountants to figure out the loopholes. And so one of the kind of intoxicating riffs that come down from the ruling class, is that, we'll reform. We'll do better. We'll get rid of these inequities. We'll pass some reform legislation, to which I say, that. Because the people who are doing the reforms are the very people who are implicit and complicit in the financial crimes themselves. So how can you ask the wolf to design the hen house? Of course he's going to keep openings that will allow him to get into the hen house. He's not going to seal it off. He's no fool. That's why he was hired, to design the hen house. That, brothers and sisters and comrades, that's what Dodd-Frank is. It is full of loopholes. It was designed by the very people that it was supposed to, monitor. Matt Taibbi has written about this in Rolling Stone in great detail. And that, again, speaks to this whole rotten apple versus rotten barrel theory of capitalism, as I call it. All our attention is on the rotten apples. Oh, that Bernie Madoff. Isn't he a terrible guy? Oh, how could he? He stole all that money from orphans, from grandmothers. He's done horrible, horrible things. Let's put him away. Let's put Roger Rottenham away, the head of the New York hedge fund called Galleon, because he made millions and millions of dollars on insider trading, which is a common practice in Wall Street. What a terrible guy. These are unlawful profits. That kind of thing goes on and on. We never talk about the barrel that produces these rotten apples. We pass prison sentences, but not for the bankers, notice. These are non-bankers. They're outside the immediate Wall Street system. And we don't talk about the barrel that constantly produces these rotten apples. Does anyone remember Ivan Boesky and Michael Milken? You remember junk bonds? Oh, legislation was passed. Wall Street was reformed. And then, this happened and that happened, and Ken Lay and Enron, and, scandal after scandal. Has anyone noticed this? Has anyone noticed since the end of 1945 there have been 16 recessions? Yeah, it's one every 3 years on average. This one is the deepest since the Great Recession. It is now going into its 6th year. We're supposedly in the 3rd year of recovery. Who's recovering? Wall Street's recovering. Corporate executive compensation packages have been recovering. They're going up. Stock market prices are going up. The people are not recovering. Millions are unemployed. 12 million people have lost their homes. Another 12 million in repossessed. Homes have been repossessed by the banks. Another 10 million are underwater. Let's just say their mortgage is worth less than the market value of their homes. There's all of this work that needs to be done in this country. Everyone acknowledges it. We need more schools and clinics and hospitals and bridges and roads and those kinds of things. There are all these people over here who don't have work, who want work, and somehow this system cannot bring them together. What does that tell you about this economic system? It has serious problems. Can it be tweaked? Can it be corrected by a little, lipstick here, a little rouge here, a little eye makeup here, a little hair dye here? Is that going to do it? Is it systemic? If it's systemic, then cosmetic approaches are not going to be effective. They will only have short-term viability until they figure out how to game the system yet again, because they own the system. They are the system. So we're talking here about a fundamental crisis of capitalism, about this economic system that, in Marx's words, has a werewolf hunger for profits. It is driven by profits, this avaricious greed. It's not because these people are evil in Wall Street or in Chicago. It's the nature of the system that drives them. And they even understand this. There was a New Yorker cartoon a few months ago. There's these, stockholders meeting, and let's say I'm the CEO, and there's, I've got some charts up here with arrows pointing in different directions. And the stockholders are getting, pretty antsy. We haven't seen any dividends from you, Mr. Barsamian. What's up here? We're paying you $800 million a year. You got your private jet, your private yacht. You got your stocks, your bonds, everything you wanted in your compensation package. Where are our dividends? And I say, well, calm down, brothers and sisters. And then I make this announcement. While the long-term prospects for the planet are grim indeed, massive starvation, famine, wars, environmental destruction. In the short term, this is a great time to make a killing. I see nothing but profits ahead of us. And the audience rises and gives him a standing ovation. They have only short-term vision. They cannot think about the long term, about the 7th generation, as Native Americans called it. That's the nature of the system. It's in its DNA. Constant plundering and looting of natural resources, of the spoiling of our freshwater systems, of depletion of aquifer, of excavation of tar sands, which I was in Alberta a few months ago, in Edmonton. It is the most environmental, and the bar is very high when I say this, the most environmentally destructive project in the history of the world. And, they want to bring it down here into the United States through pipelines. It's not going to lower the price of gas for you, by the way. Almost all of that oil is contracted to China. But it is a hugely destructive project. I've been to Nepal and Pakistan, India. India, well, I can't go there right now since I was deported. But a couple of years ago, you can see the glaciers much smaller than just a few years ago. I mean, I talked to some old-timers there who remember where the glaciers were just a few years ago. But, I don't have to go to India. I live in Colorado. I can see it with my own eyes. The Arapaho Glacier is much smaller than it was 30 years ago when I moved to Colorado. All across the Rocky Mountains, the glaciers are shrinking. Global warming is a reality. Climate change is a reality. Can the capitalist economic system address these issues? It cannot, in my view, because of its inability to think about anything but profit. about material gain, because of that werewolf hunger for profits. So unless this is radically changed, the prospects for the planet, maybe the 1% will construct some bubbles, where they'll have their own bought air and bought water to survive. And the rest of us will be living like roaches and ants, foraging in forests and probably preying on one another. That's the long-term future, unless, somehow we are able to turn this ship around. So I think, Wolff has got explanations why we're in this economic crisis, what can be done, what are alternatives. Okay, David, smart guy from New York, you got all these, critiques. Well, there are alternatives. There are credit unions, for example, which have grown enormously since the financial crisis. Billions and billions of dollars have gone from the big four Wall Street banks into local credit unions. Okay, I know it's still a banking system, but at least the money is in your community. When you go to those banks and see the bank officer, they say, oh, didn't I see you in church last week? Or, doesn't your daughter go to school with my son? Or were you at that birthday party? It's a local person. You're much more likely to get an empathetic reception and a loan as well. There's a huge growth in farmers markets and CSAs, locally controlled agriculture, in the face of Archer Daniels Midland, in the face of Cargill and Monsanto and the other big agribusinesses. That's a very encouraging move. Tens of thousands of co-ops are springing up all over the country. We don't have a national media that talks about these issues. I was just walking in San Francisco in mid-September, in Valencia, in the Mission, and I looked up, and it was a coffee house, and it said underneath it, worker-owned and operated. Then I learned that in the East Bay, a guy named Jim Curl, he's a carpenter. He has organized building tradespeople, carpenters, masons, roofers, and others, into a workers' cooperative where they share the work and the profits, and that has been a huge innovation. It's very, very successful. Maybe the most successful example is outside the United States of a co-op, Mondragon, in the Basque region of Spain, where they have 140,000 workers in a cooperative. And it's not just agriculture. They're doing all kinds of things, weaving, pottery, carpentry, building furniture, and it's very, very successful. So there are some, possibilities that are appearing in terms of creating an alternative. I mean, capitalism is not going to disappear overnight. We're not ready for it because there hasn't been enough education. Socialism, which used to have a very honorable reputation in this country, has been completely tarnished by the propaganda system. As soon as you say the word, if you say things like cooperatives and worker-owned, they say, oh, Stalin, gulags, Siberia, Soviet Union, that's what you want, death camps, right? Because of the propaganda that has tarnished the good name of socialism. Socialism had a wonderful reputation in this country up until 1920, up until the time Lenin, who was no idiot, took this prestigious word and put it into the Union of Soviet Socialist republics. And that played right into the hands of the capitalist elites who said, okay, look, you want socialism? This is it. Soviet Union had nothing to do with socialism, by the way. It only had it in its name. If socialism means anything, it means it has to be democratic. There has to be worker participation, that is, citizen participation in decisions in the society, not a totalitarian dictatorship, which the Soviet Union immediately became upon Lenin's death. So recovering that word, maybe we shouldn't use it. Maybe we should just say cooperatives or worker-owned entities and try to avoid that. But it's another thing, I think, that we need to do. And all of these are discussed by Wolff, who for my money is the best person on the economy. He's got a manifesto in here for economic democracy and ecological sanity. Again, going forward, I think what's happening in terms of the environment and the initiatives that we've been kind of hoodwinked into engaging as being effective. And driving a Prius, recycling newspaper and cardboard and glass. Okay, I mean, those are good things. I don't drive a Prius, but I drive a Honda Civic. But I do those other things. I try and bike as much as I can. I know we're all very, very virtuous. Our caca does not smell. But these are intoxications. These will not fundamentally change the drift of where we are going, where the planet is going in terms of environmental destruction. We're making, these are just incremental steps. We need a radical restructuring of the economy. And that's not going to happen anytime soon under capitalism, which is unable to change its spots. You're asking the leopard to change its spots. It cannot. It has to generate what it calls growth and jobs and profits in order to sustain itself. So I'm going to close. That's an applause line, folks. Woo, finally. I thought it'd never end. It just goes on and on. Well, it's the curse of being a double Gemini, I guess. I want to close with some poetry. First of all, from Pablo Neruda, Nobel Prize winner from Chile, who talked about imperialism, who witnessed it firsthand, who saw fascism triumph in Spain when he was a Chilean diplomat there. And he wrote a poem called The Standard Oil Company. This is the old Esso. This is the old John D. Rockefeller owned what is today ExxonMobil. Standard Oil Company. Their obese emperors from New York are suave, smiling assassins who buy silk, nylon cigars. Petty tyrants and dictators. They buy countries, people, seas, police, county councils, distant regions, like misers. Standard Oil takes them all, clothes them in uniforms, designates which brother is the enemy. A president assassinated for a drop of petroleum. A 1 million-acre mortgage, a swift execution in the morning. In Patagonia, betrayal, scattered shots. In the capital, a whisper like an oil tide. And zap, you'll see how Standard Oil's letters shine above the clouds, above the seas in your own home, illuminating their dominions. Then we have Arundhati Roy of India. Where can I find Arundhati? I know she's here. Before we get to Arundhati Roy, I'm going to talk about Marge Piercy, wonderful American poet, who wrote a collection of poems called The Moon is Always Female. Why am I using poetry now? I mean, what's that about? Well, I think, after you hear a certain amount of information, and hopefully you'll process it and do something with it, we have to feed other parts of the brain too. That creative part, that other area which breathes humanity and creativity. And that's why I think, poetry and music and humor, that's why I created that character, Dick Veneer of Facade News. He follows me everywhere around the country. This is called The Low Road from her collection, The Moon is Always Female, Marge Piercy, and it speaks to solidarity and the need for community. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up, they can bust you, they can break your fingers, they can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child. They can do anything. You can't stop them. How can you stop them? Alone you can fight, you can refuse, you can take what revenge you can, but they roll over you. But two people fighting back to back can keep each other sane, can give support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. 3 people are a delegation. With 4 you can play bridge and start an organization. With 6 you can rent a whole house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen make a demonstration, 100 fill a hall. It goes on one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again, and they said no. It starts when you say we and know who you mean, and each day you mean one more. Now, I want to take you to South Asia for a moment, a region of the world that I've spent a good part of my life. The greatest Urdu poet of the 20th century is Faiz Ahmed Faiz. It's F-A-I-Z. It's kind of unusual. His first name and his last name is the same. He was a Red and proud of it. He was a journalist and proud of it. He was a union member and proud of it. And he fought US-supported dictators in Pakistan and served in jail because of his political outspokenness. His most famous poem is called Bol. Now, this is a word now you'll know in Hindi and in Urdu, these two great languages. It's the imperative to speak. So in India, which uses the Devanagari script, Hindi, as the national script and language, at every demonstration you'll see signs that just say B-O-L, Bol, speak. And in neighboring Pakistan and in Kashmir as well, which is under Indian occupation, where Urdu is spoken, it is in the Persian Arabic script, the same word, Bol. Bol ke lab azad hai tere, bol zaban ab tak teri hai. Speak, your lips are free. Speak, your tongue is still yours. This magnificent body is still yours. Speak, Bol, your life is still yours. Speak, there is little time, but little though it is enough time, enough before the body perishes, before the tongue atrophies. Speak, the truth still lives. Say what you have to say. Speak, your lips are free. Bol. Faiz Ahmed Faiz. And you know, I did mention I live in Boulder, Colorado. It's the home of Naropa University, and there's a Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poets there, and established by Allen Ginsberg, and a lot of great poets come. Gary Snyder and others. And if they get 70, 80 people at a poetry reading, they're tickled pink. They think, wow, look at the interest in Boulder, man. This is a really hip place. They're really supporting poetry. Well, I got news, brothers and sisters, in Boulder and elsewhere. Like places like Pakistan, which we, ridicule and is derided constantly as some kind of backward, misogynist, patriarchal hellhole, they have a very rich tradition of poetry. Hundreds of thousands of people turn out for poetry readings in Pakistan and in India as well. And these are educated poetry savants. I mean, if a poet like Faiz, if he recites the first line, they'll repeat the second line before he even gets to it. They know the poetry that intimately. So it's, other parts of the world have, their own cultural traditions. Arundhati Roy of India is, for me, the finest writer, political essayist in the world today, writing in English. Absolutely brilliant, incisive, terse, cogent, and above all, poetic. And she writes, she's in great danger. She's threatened by Hindu nationalists. She speaks out about the Indian occupation and atrocities that are going on in Kashmir as well as elsewhere. Her home has been attacked. Meetings are routinely broken up by Hindu thugs that insult her and disrupt the gatherings. She's an extraordinary person. I just did a program with her called Capitalism, a Ghost Story, which talks a lot about what the capitalists are doing inside of India, which is not very different from what capitalists are doing elsewhere. They're looting, they're plundering, they're maximizing profit. It's not because they're evil, it's the system that produces those kinds of impulses. She wrote this in 2002, 10 years ago, in New Mexico. Fortunately, power has a shelf life. When the time comes, maybe this mighty empire will, like others before it, overreach itself and implode from within. It looks as though structural cracks have already appeared. As the war on terror casts its net wider and wider, America's corporate heart is hemorrhaging. There's endless empty chatter about democracy. But a world run by a handful of greedy bankers and CEOs who nobody elected can't possibly last. The time has come, the walrus said. Perhaps things will get worse and then better. Perhaps there's a small God up in heaven readying herself for us. Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. Maybe many of us won't be here to greet her, but on a quiet day, If I listen very carefully, I can hear her breathing. Arundhati Roy. And finally, one of my great cultural heroes, and I think one of the major artists that this country has produced in recent times, Gil Scott-Heron. Probably the progenitor of rap and hip-hop. In fact, if you listen to Dr. Dre and some of the other artists, they all pay homage to Gil Scott-Heron. He's the one who trailblazed this particular field, way of culturally expressing oneself. And maybe his most famous piece is called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." As an editor of alternative radio, I'm going to take the liberty to slightly edit his words in this song to kind of give it a more 2012 flavor. And this, of course, will be to A Night in Tunisia. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. You'll not be able to stay home, brothers and sisters. You'll not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You'll not be able to lose yourself on Star Trek reruns, skip out for beer during commercials, because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by J.P. Morgan, Chase, Wells Fargo, Citicorp, and Bank of America in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by CBS, PBS, MSNBC, CNN, NPR, or ABC, nor will it star Julia Roberts and Tom Hanks. The revolution will not give your mouth sex appeal. The revolution will not get rid of zits. The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds lighter, because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised, brothers and sisters. You'll not have to worry about iPhones, iPads, iMacs, iClouds, or iPods. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution theme song will not be written by Justin Bieber or sung by Lady Gaga or Taylor Swift. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado or whiteout, white lightning, white chocolate, or white people. You'll not have to worry about a dove in your bedroom, a tiger in your tank, or the giant in your toilet bowl. The revolution will not go better with Coke, Pepsi, Sprint, or Diet 7-Up, or Dad's Root Beer. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised, not be televised, not be televised. There'll be no rerun, brothers and sisters. The revolution will be live on alternative radio. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yay, Yellow Springs. Que viva, arriba el Thank you very much. Now I got news for you. Those were my opening remarks. I have a speech here I've written. I've worked on it for hours and hours. Okay, I think I'll quit while I'm ahead. Maybe have a couple of questions from the audience, and then I'd like to sign some books and get you to get some of these CDs. Yes?
Well, I think your show is the best show on the radio, and I wonder, where do you hear about the people who you feature?
The comment is about, very flattering comment. I think alternative radio is the best show on radio. And where do I find the voices? Well, sometimes the voices find me. Right now, actually, I'm in touch with David Suzuki, the great Canadian environmentalist. I'm going to be going to Santa Fe to interview him in a couple of weeks. I mean, that just happened today. I heard he was going to be in Santa Fe. I have a network now. I've been doing this work for more than 30 years. So people in Seattle, Portland, Oregon, LA, Amherst, Mass, and other parts of the country, they say, hey, David, you know, so-and-so's coming to town, Michael Clare or Vandana Shiva, someone like that, you know, do you want a recording? So I encourage people to contact me. Also here in this area, I don't have anyone sending me material. If you hear of a great speaker, please record him or her and, you know, share the audio with me, and we'll get it on the air. So it's, you know, it's a very grassroots operation. Even that is too heavy of a word. So I would call it a, you know, a grassroots effort to really live up to the ignored standards of the Public Broadcasting Act, which established public radio and public TV here in the United States in the 1970s, specifically to provide a voice for those in the community who may otherwise be unheard, to give voice to the unrepresented. unrepresented. So you have people talking about imperialism, about environmental degradation, about what's going on in Pakistan, about US imperialism, not hedging their bets, not using euphemisms and, you know, gobbledygook language in order to impress people with, you know, mastery of polysyllabics, but talking in language that is concrete, that is clear. This is what's going on. There's looting and plundering. The planet is being destroyed. Do you realize this is what's going on? What can be done about it? So it's an effort that I've been doing. I'm glad to do it. You know, and I'll continue to do it as long as I have support. But, you know, look at the situation here in Ohio. It's on one station at 6 o'clock in the morning on Sunday. Effectively, it's not on. You know, you could say it's on the schedule. I have one faithful, you know, listener who apparently gets up and listens every Sunday morning at 6. And then, you know, a few here in Central Ohio who listen to WYSO. But it's really tough because National Public Radio, the affiliates of National Public Radio, have gotten enormously timid over the years. They've completely lost whatever cutting edge they had. It was, you know, let's not exaggerate it. It was never really sharp, but it was a kind of alternative for a while. But now they've just, you know, under political attack, under constant carping, that it's, you know, it's an elite medium for people living in a sandbox and those kinds of things. It's very difficult to get on the big NPR stations. You know, for example, I can't get alternative radio on in Boston, like considered the most liberal city in the country. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Miami, you know, go up and down the East Coast, and of course the entire South. You know, it's very difficult. It's a little bit different in the West, I must say, the part of the country where I live. For example, I'm on in Montana. I mean, you wouldn't expect that, right? Militias, yahoos, and crazies. I'm on in Idaho, all over Washington State, Oregon, all over California, all over New Mexico, all over Colorado. So it's a little bit different west of the Mississippi, but this part of the country, it's really tough. But I think because the ideological stakes are higher here.
So we should all ask why so that we have the show on twice a week.
By the way, it's free of charge to all stations, so they can't say, "Oh, we can't afford it," or, you know, David will charge extra. No, it's free. Unlike Marketplace and Morning Edition, and that's MOURNING, Morning Edition.
David Suzuki, you were just in Yellow Springs. He was here a few months ago.
Oh, really? Well, great. I'll be seeing him in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, it was right here.
He was right here in this theater.
Did anyone record him?
Yes.
Where's the tape?
I'll give it to you tomorrow.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I don't like Eisenhower as much as you do. You mentioned in your speech the overthrow of Mossadegh,
Yeah.
and
That was Ike's
the
story.
overthrow of
Arbenz.
in Guatemala. You mentioned the years they happened. You didn't mention who was president then.
Yeah, they were under Ike. But the point I was making was, if he were alive today, he would be seen as a radical because of his views on the military-industrial complex. He would not have a place in the Republican Party. But those were catastrophic things that he did, no doubt about it. Good, so we're all in agreement. Thank you very much.